So I grew up in East Mesa, and I grew up in a very broken home. My mom was a drug addict slash alcoholic who had numerous abusive drug addict alcoholic men in her life, which that made them to be in my life, of course. The neighborhood I grew up in was an extremely bad neighborhood that was full of crime and drugs, so I had a lot of poor examples in the home and outside of the home growing up. I actually was a pretty good student in school, but that all stopped around fifth grade when I started just hanging out with older kids and getting into crime and drugs myself. The first time I smoked weed was the age of 11, my 11th birthday, with my older brother. He was 6 years older than me, and like I said, I was already involved in crime and drugs by that age. At the age of 12, I started using methamphetamines. By the age of 15, that was the first time I ever put a needle in my arm, and by the age of 16, I knew I was destined for prison. And 6 years later, at the age of 22, after about 10 years solid of criminal activity and drug use, I ended up in prison my first time for a 9.25-year sentence in the Arizona Department of Corrections. While in county jail, I was introduced to Jesus, but I only knew him as Savior, and I thought I had fire insurance. I thought I could just continue to live the way that I wanted to live and die and go to heaven. I thought that I was going to change myself and be a productive member of society, and I did okay for a while. Throughout my prison sentence, my first time, I went to church on occasion. I worked full time. I read a couple of Bible verses every now and then, and I prayed a few prayers, but I never had a relationship. So as I walked out of prison my first time, I was very full of pride, and I thought I had it all figured out. And when I walked out, I completely put the Bible down and stopped saying prayers. I actually knew that I couldn't go back to my old life. I got a letter from a woman from my past about 8 months before I walked out, and knowing that I couldn't go back to my past, I still ultimately started writing her, and I ended up going back to my past. I started having contact with my mom, who was still addicted to drugs, and in my pride I thought that I could maybe go out there and be a good influence to people. Just, I got this, I'm sober, I'm going to help these other people get sober, and I'm going to live a different life, be a productive member of society. So I did okay for a while. Like I said, I walked out into this relationship immediately, and I don't know, about a year and a half after I walked out of prison, I got a piece of steel embedded in my eye. And the woman that I was with at the time, she was already addicted to painkillers. She had beaten cancer 4 times, and she was just an addict, basically, and they were just giving it to her. That's what it came down to. Misery loves company. At first, I wasn't going to fill the prescription because I was still staying strong, being sober, and I allowed myself to be talked into filling the prescription. The first time I took those pills, that was the end of my sobriety, and not too long after that, that relationship ended, and I was back on meth full time. Long story short, a couple years later, I had a couple more charges, and I was heading back to prison for another 4.5 years. That was at the age of 34. So this time walking into prison, I was on a warpath. I was getting high. I was running amok while in prison, and I was doing everything under the sun. I was mad at God. I was mad at the world. And one day, a gentleman said something to me about something I wasn't supposed to be doing according to the rules in there, and I basically told them, if you have a problem with it, I'll see you when I get home from work. So him and I ended up getting into a fight, and we got caught, and they moved me to a higher level custody yard because of the fight. That was God's hand, moving me away from this open yard, all of this freedom. He was listening to my cries. That's how I see it now. I didn't understand it in the moment, of course. So I ended up on this higher custody yard. I went from living in a dorm setting, which has between 20 and 30 people in it. It's very open. It's a very open yard, to living in a two-man cell. And also I was stripped away from all the drugs that I was using. Like I said, I was on a warpath. As I started to go through withdrawals and started to have a lot more time to think and not mask everything, I really started to come to the conclusion that I was 34 years old. I had already spent all of my 20s in prison. I was now going to spend the latter half of my 30s in prison, and my life was over. I was seriously contemplating suicide, and for months I walked back and forth from the shower contemplating suicide, and I was getting ready to do it. I wasn't broadcasting it. I was putting on the happy face, and I was really ready to just end my life. And one day when I was very serious about it, I was in the shower and I was crying out to God, basically asking permission. And he simply, he said no. He said, I have a purpose for you. That was the day that I surrendered my life to Christ. That was December 15th of 2014. That was the day, like my wife says, I picked up my Bible and I haven't turned back since. I would have to say that my favorite person in the Bible is the Apostle Paul, other than Jesus, of course. But it's because of his testimony. He made a complete 180. He went from murdering Christians and persecuting the church to being one of the most prominent figures in the Bible today, in the New Testament anyway. So I think that just the turnaround, it's the same turnaround he can make in our lives, no matter where we come from. So with God,
all things are possible.